When we think of the Germans in World War II, the default thought is usually that of the merciless Gestapo and SS agents who terrorized their enemies. But that doesn't represent the whole truth. Some of the German regulars, those who weren't part of the Gestapo or SS, weren't all that bad. In his book, SAS Great Escapes, author Damien Lewis highlights that fact by sharing the story of how a German doctor and a major worked together to save the life of an English prisoner of war whom the Gestapo wanted dead. This is the miraculous story of Quentin Hughes. On January 12, 1944, 6 British Special Air Service members, 2 officers and 4 paratroopers jumped from a C-47 Dakota under the cover of darkness down to the Italian countryside. They were carrying out Operation Pomegranate, an Allied effort to attack German aircraft stored at the Italian airfield of Sant'Egidio, about 100 miles north of Rome. From the beginning, the operation had major troubles. Just after the paratroopers jumped safely from their aircraft, the plane crashed into the side of a nearby mountain, killing everybody on board. On the ground, the paratroopers faced their own difficulties from the moment they landed. Though they were in the countryside, the land was crawling with enemies and they could only move at night across the most difficult terrain in order to avoid detection. Their packs weighed them down with detonators, fuses, and explosives, along with their rations and guns. One of the members of the group later recalled that the going was very difficult. The group hiked around the western shore of Lake Trasimeno and spent 2 days climbing more than 3,000 feet over Mount Tetsuo. Then went east toward River Tiber, which British intelligence had assured them would be crossable that time of the year. However, recent heavy rain and runoff from the mountains had flooded the river, making it impossible to wade across, which had been their original plan. They followed the flow of the river down until they came across a wire suspended above the water, which led them to a small hut where they found a very sketchy looking hand-operated cable car. With no other options, the men crossed the river 2 by 2, somehow managing to avoid detection. Or, at least, that's what they thought at the time. As they walked away, they heard a German voice shouting into the night, ordering them to stop and to identify themselves. The group immediately scattered, finding cover wherever they could. One of the officers and the focus of our story, Lieutenant Quentin Hughes, tried to determine the size of the force they were facing from his hiding spot between 2 buildings, but had nothing to go off. After several minutes of waiting, Hughes, along with the only other person in the alley with him, Troop Commander Major Anthony Widrington, decided it must have been a lone German soldier who had spotted them and didn't fancy his odds against a group of enemy soldiers. They were able to navigate their way through a series of farm buildings to retrace their steps and deliver themselves to the relative safety of the untouched land on the other side. But now they had to face the next challenge, which was finding the rest of their team. Hughes used his SAS training to imitate the calls of nocturnal birds to try and call out to them, but was again met with silence. Hughes and Widrington began to search the surrounding area, but after 45 minutes and no leads, they had no choice but to give up. With only 1/3 of their original group still in action, Hughes and Widrington had a difficult decision to make. 1. Abandon the mission and head toward Allied territory in the south. 2. Go forth with the operation, just the 2 of them. Operation Pomegranate was a support mission for the larger Operation Shingle, whose objective was to break through German lines and take Rome for the Allies. It was an important operation that the Allies hoped would lead to a total German withdrawal from Italy. The airfield that Operation Pomegranate was set to attack contained planes that were the most likely to spot Operation Shingle's fleet sailing toward Italy during reconnaissance flights. As Hughes put it, their job was to put out the eyes of the Germans. Without those planes, the Germans would have no hope of spotting the incoming fleet until it was too late. For that very reason, Hughes and Widrington decided to push on. They moved at night and rested during the day, but the going was so difficult that the men had to rely on benzodrine and amphetamine to help keep them from buckling under the immense exhaustion. As the sun set on January 17th, they arrived at the airbase, just 4 days before the scheduled start of Operation Shingle. With the rapid loss of light, the men couldn't make out the exact positions of the aircraft, and all the time they had spent poring over the details and layouts of the field proved to be somewhat useless to them as they struggled to get their bearings. However, by a stroke of pure chance and luck, 4 Ju-88s landed on the runway, one of them crashing and catching fire. The blaze illuminated the airfield enough that Hughes and Widrington were able to make out the perimeter of the field. Now armed with the intel they needed to carry out their mission, the men hid themselves and rested up, planning to strike the following day. They each had 12 Lewis bombs, lightweight explosives designed specifically for the SAS with the ability to burn for a longer duration. When the time finally came, they snuck onto the airfield and began placing the explosives onto different aircraft. They made sure the bombs were all primed to blow at the same time, so as not to give the Germans any time to disarm them once the first one went off. After they both finished putting the bombs on their targets, the 2 men retreated and began the work of defusing the remaining bombs they had in their possession. In order to make sure all the bombs exploded at the same time, they had to pull the fuses all at once. But due to the chilly air of central Italy in January, the fuses took more time to burn, giving the men a grace period of about 2 hours to lay them all out. Hughes and Widrington had no idea how long it had taken them to place the explosives on the planes, so they had to work quickly to defuse the remaining ones. But just as Hughes finished defusing the final bomb, he looked over at Widrington just in time to see his commanding officer be consumed by flames as one of his explosives detonated. The force of the explosion was strong enough that Hughes was blown into the air. Somehow, he managed to stand up, but his eyes weren't working correctly. When he tried to touch them, all he could feel was pulp. I was blinded and near completely deaf. He tried to find Widrington by crawling on his hands and knees and patting the ground around him. He eventually found his commander after faintly making out Widrington's moans. Though Hughes couldn't see him, he knew it was dire, as he could smell Widrington's burnt flesh. The explosion had blown off the commander's hands, along with a massive chunk of his abdomen. Hughes, shocked that Widrington was still alive, gathered him in his arms. As he did so, the bombs they had placed around the airfield detonated. Miraculously, despite all odds, their mission was successful. At that point, their most pressing matter was finding help, because, without it, both men were sure to die. Hughes knew that escape with his injuries was nigh impossible, let alone Widrington's. There was really only one way either of them had a chance of survival, and that was capture. So Hughes raised his Colt 45 pistol above his head and fired every last bullet into the air to get the Germans' attention. He then quickly managed to burn all the incriminating documents he and Widrington had been carrying to eliminate any hard evidence of the sabotage before falling into unconsciousness. When Hughes finally came to, he found himself in a German hospital in Perugia, Italy. Unfortunately, he was there alone, as Widrington had succumbed to his injuries shortly after being discovered by the Germans. The Gestapo were eager to interrogate Hughes, but with his hearing still severely damaged and his eyes bandaged, he was of little use to them. He could hear his doctor arguing with them loudly in German by his bed, insisting that his patient was in no condition to be answering any of their questions and that they would have to wait for Hughes to recover. The Gestapo reluctantly agreed, but ordered that Hughes be kept away from all other Allied patients, so he was moved to a ward reserved for German officers. There, he felt isolated, unable to talk with anyone, and he began to descend into a dark place. The only solace he found was with his German physician, Dr. Hans-Gunga Sonkerath, who would sit by Hughes's bed at the end of every shift and just chat with him, and the men bonded. Hughes recalled, "We talked of fishing, walking, and playing in the woods." As the camaraderie and trust between the men grew, Hughes offered his parole to Sonkarat. Offering parole means that Hughes would not attempt to escape so long as he was under the doctor's charge. In exchange, Sonkarat promised that he would do anything he could to save Hughes's sight. He even called in a specialist eye surgeon to take a look at Hughes's eyes. They learned that saving his sight was not a lost cause, and through time and treatment, Hughes gradually regained his vision in one eye and was delighted when he was able to see his new friend for the first time. To celebrate his patient's restored vision, Sonkarat bought Hughes a book on architecture. During one of their many chats, Hughes had expressed his desire to return to his native Liverpool after the end of the war to study architecture and help rebuild what had been destroyed. But Sonkarat knew that the Gestapo had no intention of letting Hughes live to see the end of the war. With Hughes's condition improving, it was becoming more and more difficult for the doctor to stave off the Gestapo. Eventually, one member of the Gestapo got through and sat at Hughes's bedside. His only job was to get as much information about the SAS out of Hughes as possible, but under the Geneva Convention, Hughes was only required to give his name, rank, and serial number to the officer. But those rules only applied to prisoners of war being held by their enemy, and as the Gestapo officer informed Hughes, he was not being considered a prisoner of war. The Führer himself had issued a commando order stating that any and all saboteurs captured by the Germans would be executed. The best Hughes could hope for out of this situation was clemency, and in order to get it, he had to answer all of the officers' questions truthfully. Hughes was shocked and didn't know if what the Gestapo said about the commando order was true, with the confusion stemming from the fact that Hitler had secretly issued the order in October of 1942. At that point, Hughes had no choice but to assume it was true and start talking. However, he had to be smart. He needed to strike a very delicate balance between giving the Gestapo information they thought they wanted and not telling them anything that could be used against the SAS. He started telling them exactly where he and Widrington had stashed their supplies. He also talked about the 2 years he'd spent in Malta, during which time the SAS had been protecting supply lines in the Mediterranean from enemy attacks. Though Hughes didn't directly work for the SAS at the time, he worked alongside them. In fact, Operation Pomegranate was his first with the SAS. But since the Maltese campaign had since ended, he felt confident that his information wouldn't compromise his brothers in the SAS. The Gestapo officer was satisfied with Hughes's information, and as he left his bedside, he informed Hughes that once he made a full recovery, the Gestapo were still going to shoot him. Hughes didn't let the news of his impending execution dampen his spirits too much. Quite the opposite, in fact. He continued to hang out with Sonkarat and also made another friend, another of the doctor's patients, Major Gerhard Schacht, an officer of the Fallschirmjäger, the German equivalent to the British Parachute Regiment. The two men bonded over their shared experience as paratroopers after Schacht introduced himself, interested in meeting the Englishman who had sabotaged the Sant Egidio airfield. Hughes called the Major very friendly and pleasant, even though they were sworn enemies. But it didn't seem to bother Hughes, Schacht, or the doctor, who actually ended up introducing Hughes to the rest of the German officers on the ward. Hughes said that though the war had to be fought, there was no hate between us. After a time, they even began to have parties. The men listened to British and German radio. They danced, sang, and talked like friends. Hughes described the parties as rambunctious affairs, but it wasn't all fun for him. The parties were held in Dr. Sonkarat's office, where a detailed map of Italy hung on the far wall. Though Hughes planned to keep his word to the doctor and had no plans to escape while under his care, he knew that eventually he would be in someone else's ward before the Gestapo shot him, and he planned to use that time to escape. He studied the map when he could without making it too obvious. Though the German officers were friendly with him, there was still a war going on, and they fought on opposite sides. His survival depended on him seeming like a harmless patient with no intention of running. But how could he not have the intention of running? After all, he was being nursed back to health just to ultimately be killed, a pig being raised for the slaughter. After some time, Major Schacht recovered from his injuries and returned to the field, going to work for the German commander-in-chief in Italy. Not long after his departure, Schacht invited Hughes and the doctor to dinner. There, Schacht asked Hughes to desert the Allies and join the Axis forces. Since Hughes was an elite service member, his expertise would have naturally been extremely useful to the German cause. In addition, Schacht promised that Hughes would not be asked to fight against the British or any Western power, but instead fight the Soviets. Hughes actually considered the proposition for a moment, if for no other reason to continue to spend time with his new German friends. But truthfully, he knew that he didn't have it in him to join the Axis side. He told Schacht that he was honored by the officer and that he would consider it, but it was somewhat useless given that the Gestapo wanted him dead. And he had a point. Not long after the dinner, Dr. Sondgerhardt informed Hughes that the Gestapo wanted to take him into their custody within the next few days. Hughes fell into a deep depression, knowing what his fate in the hands of the Gestapo would be, and knowing that his family would never have the full story of what happened to him, how he had made the best of a bad situation, and even forged friendships in the most unlikely of circumstances. However, it would be those friendships that would ultimately save Hughes's life. Sondgerhardt and Schacht couldn't bear to see their English friend executed. They knew they could save him if they had his status changed from illegal saboteur to prisoner of war, but neither of them held that kind of power. In fact, the only man who did was Field Marshal Kesselring. And it just so happened that the Kesselrings and the Schachts were old family friends. Just days before Hughes was scheduled to be handed over to the Gestapo, Schacht travelled 100 miles to Florence, where Kesselring was headquartered. There, Schacht pleaded Hughes's case personally. On the day Hughes was scheduled to be turned over to the Gestapo, he was oddly calm, having finally accepted his fate. But the Gestapo never came. Instead, it was Dr. Sondgerhardt who entered Hughes's room with the news that Schacht had done what they had thought impossible, changed Hughes's classification to prisoner of war. They had very little time to celebrate though. The Gestapo were furious and certainly going to do everything in their power to get the change overturned so they could execute Hughes. They had to move quickly. Schacht and Sondgerhardt had already arranged for Hughes to be taken to a Luftwaffe camp in Germany to keep him out of the POW collecting center in Verona, where the Gestapo were most definitely going to be looking for him. As Hughes and the doctor said their final goodbyes, Hughes asked if he could withdraw his parole, essentially asking permission to make an escape. Sondgerhardt agreed, emotional, and wished his English friend good luck. As Hughes sat on the train taking him to a POW camp in Florence, he thought about his new friends. They had risked being court-martialed or worse by helping him. Without them, he would have been murdered by the Gestapo, his life tossed away like it was nothing. Hughes said many Germans committed the most appalling atrocities. Some were capable of great humanity and decency toward their foes. Because of the actions of the doctor and the major, Hughes was able to escape from the clutches of the Germans, taking him on a journey that saw him jumping out of a moving train, trekking through the Apennine Mountains, teaming up with members of the Italian resistance, befriending British army officers, and sailing a rickety old boat in the open sea to Allied territory. Hughes's ultimate survival in the war was nothing short of a miracle that would not have been possible without his German friends. After the war, Hughes returned to Liverpool, where he became the architect he had dreamed of being. He looked up his old friends to see what had become of them after the war. Unfortunately, Dr. Sondgerhardt had been executed after trying to organize a group to surrender to the Allies. Schacht, on the other hand, did survive the war and enjoyed a long career in the post-war German army. It's unclear if Hughes ever reached out to Schacht, but it's hard to imagine that the two men would ever have forgotten their special friendship. But what do you think? Why were the German regulars like Schacht and Sondgerhardt so much more lenient with the enemy than the Gestapo? Why were they so different even though they fought for the same side? Do you know of any other stories of German regulars helping Allied soldiers? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.